Daniel Carter lived in the shadows of his wife, Sophia. To the world, she was a force, a successful CEO of Summit Innovations, admired and respected for her sharp mind and undeniable business acumen. But to Daniel, she was a constant reminder of his own failure. He had once been a visionary too, but somewhere along the way he'd fallen behind, retreating into the quiet corners of their life together. Now he was known as the failed husband, a title he wore reluctantly, even if it was a truth he couldn't escape. He sat at the back of every important meeting, barely noticeable, his presence barely acknowledged by the executives who gathered around the table. While Sophia commanded attention with every word, Daniel's opinions were dismissed, his contributions undermined. Those around him assumed his silence meant incompetence, that he lacked the drive or vision to match his wife's success. But in reality, Daniel was anything but ordinary. Beneath the surface of this failed husband was a mind sharper than most could imagine, and a secret power that not even Sophia knew he possessed. It was a power that could shake the foundations of Summit Innovations, and Daniel was starting to realize he could no longer hide it. There was something more to him, something dangerous, and the time to reveal it was fast approaching. Daniel moved through life like a shadow, silent, unnoticed, and fading into the background. He had long since given up on trying to prove himself to Sophia. Their marriage, once full of potential and promise, had become toxic. Sophia had no patience for anything less than perfection, and Daniel had long since fallen short of her expectations. Her criticisms, though often veiled in concern, felt like daggers to his already fragile self-worth. At home, she would belittle him, mock his lack of ambition, reminding him of how she had built her career while he'd chosen to stay behind. His colleagues at Summit Innovations weren't any kinder. They saw him as a non-entity, a shadow of his wife's greatness. Most days he sat in the corner of the office, his role as Chief Operations Officer reduced to little more than administrative drudgery. No one cared to listen to his ideas. His meetings were forgotten before they even began. The constant dismissals made him feel small, as though his talents, his true potential, had been buried beneath years of neglect and silence. The corporate culture at Summit Innovations thrived on power, and Daniel, the overlooked cog in the machine, had grown resentful. He watched as his wife climbed higher and higher, while his own influence seemed to shrink with each passing day. He had once been the visionary behind Summit's early success, a silent architect of its innovations, but now he was nothing more than a placeholder, a failed husband with nothing left to offer but silence. But something had changed. A quiet dissatisfaction was growing within him. The longer he stayed in the background, the more he felt the weight of his own potential pressing against his chest. Daniel was tired of living in Sophia's shadow. He wanted more than to just exist in her world. He wanted to take control of his own life, to break free from the life she had built for them. And the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. If he didn't take action soon, he might lose everything. The tipping point came during a routine board meeting. Daniel was barely paying attention as he sat at the long table, surrounded by the usual crowd of power-hungry executives. Sophia was speaking, her voice filled with her usual confidence as she laid out the company's next big project. Daniel's mind wandered, tired of hearing the same rehearsed pitch, but then something caught his ear. Sophia's words. She mentioned a new partnership that had been forged without consulting him. A partnership that, unbeknownst to him, was a direct result of a project he had spearheaded years ago, a project he had laid the groundwork for, but which had now been entirely stolen. As Sophia took credit for the deal, Daniel felt the familiar sting of betrayal. But this time, it was different. This time, he was done being overlooked. He'd been living in Sophia's shadow for too long, playing the role of the obedient husband, the silent partner. But this was too much. The realization hit him like a wave. He had let her erase him, let her take credit for his work, all while dismissing his contributions. He had played along, let her have her moment in the sun, but now he was ready to take the spotlight for himself as the meeting wrapped up and people filed out. Daniel stayed seated, his hands clenched tightly against the armrests. A sense of clarity washed over him. He didn't need to play second fiddle to Sophia anymore. He didn't need her approval, her validation, or her constant criticism. He had his own vision, his own legacy, and he would make sure the world knew it. The decision was made. It was time to reclaim what was rightfully his, and this time, there would be no holding back. As Daniel sat in his office, staring at the reports of Summit Innovations' latest quarter, a slow-burning anger began to take root within him. He had always known the company wasn't as clean as it appeared, but the deeper he looked, the more unsettling the truth became. What started as a personal vendetta against those who had stolen his ideas soon evolved into something much larger. Fraudulent activities, harassment, and deep-rooted corruption ran like a poison through the veins of Summit Innovations. And Daniel, the man no one paid attention to, was in the perfect position to do something about it. He began his investigation quietly, using his access to the company's systems and financial records. It was easy enough to slip into the background and sift through data, unnoticed. The more he uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The executives, including Melissa, Angela, Greg, and Scott, had been pilfering from the company for years. Manipulating contracts, bribing officials, covering up workplace harassment, all of it had been swept under the rug to protect the company's image. The employees who had raised concerns were either silenced or blacklisted. And there, buried beneath the layers of lies, was his own story. Daniel's contributions had been stolen, twisted, and erased for the sake of profit and power. Daniel's strategic mind, once dulled by years of living in the shadows, sprang to life as he pieced together the evidence. He reached out to former employees who had been wronged, people who had been cast aside or forced out. They were eager to talk, to finally have someone listen to their stories. Daniel knew that the evidence he was gathering wouldn't just expose corruption. It would take down the very people who had belittled him and crushed his spirit. He was no longer the passive bystander in his own life. He was the architect of his own plan. Each day, Daniel grew more confident. He was no longer the failed husband or the overlooked COO. He was the man in control of Summit Innovations, and he was about to take back everything that was rightfully his. He positioned himself carefully, making connections with key players in the company, reaching out to those who could help him topple the corrupt leaders. His silent power was now a weapon, and he intended to use it. The time had come to reveal the truth. It was a late afternoon when Daniel called a meeting in the sleek, glass-walled conference room that had long been the heart of Summit Innovations. Sophia was there, of course, the queen of the empire, surrounded by the executives who had built their wealth on manipulation and lies. She didn't notice the shift in the air, the change in Daniel's posture, as he walked into the room with a quiet confidence that felt almost foreign. The room fell silent as he took his seat at the head of the table, the seat he had long been denied. For a moment, no one spoke. Sophia glanced at him, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. Something was different about him. But before anyone could say anything, Daniel spoke. "I think it's time we had a real discussion," he said, his voice calm and steady, "about what's been happening behind the scenes at Summit Innovations." He pulled out a folder filled with evidence, the financial reports, the emails, the testimonies of those who had been wronged. The documents landed on the table with a quiet thud, each one more damning than the last. Melissa's name, Angela's, Greg's, and Scott's all were implicated in fraudulent activities, including embezzlement, sexual harassment, and bribery. Daniel had everything, proof of their actions, their manipulation, and their lies. As he laid out the details, one by one, each executive's face turned pale. Melissa, once the proud CFO, squirmed in her seat as Daniel revealed how she had manipulated the company's books for years, funneling millions into offshore accounts. Angela's eyes darted around nervously as he exposed her role in covering up multiple cases of harassment, all to protect the company's image. Greg and Scott, who had used their positions to intimidate and silence anyone who dared challenge them, were now exposed as nothing more than power-hungry frauds. Sophia sat frozen, disbelief flashing across her face. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Where did you get this?" Daniel's cold gaze met hers. "I've been running this company, Sophia. You've been too busy building your empire to notice." The shock in her eyes was palpable. All these years, she had thought she was the mastermind behind Summit Innovations. But Daniel had been there all along, quietly pulling the strings, letting her take the credit. He had designed the systems, the strategies, and the acquisitions that had made Summit so successful. And now, he was pulling it all out into the open. "I'm the CEO of Summit Innovations," he continued, his voice low and precise. "Not you. You've used me, belittled me, stolen from me, and now it's over." The tension in the room was suffocating. Sophia's eyes widened, then narrowed in anger. "You've been hiding this from me all along," she hissed, her voice rising. "You think you can just take control from me? You think you can expose all of this and walk away unscathed?" Daniel didn't flinch. "I'm not walking away from anything. I'm taking back what's mine." He turned his attention to the executives, his gaze icy. "You're all fired, effective immediately. Melissa, Angela, Greg, Scott, your crimes have been documented, and I'll be making sure the authorities know about them. You're done here." Sophia stood up, her face twisted in fury. "You can't do this, Daniel. I built this company. This is my company." "No," Daniel said calmly. "You built an illusion, and now it's time for the truth to come out." As the executives scrambled to make excuses, Daniel remained calm, collected, and utterly in control. He had been the silent observer for far too long. Now the tables had turned, and he was the one holding the power. He wasn't just exposing their crimes, he was reclaiming his life, his legacy, and his place at the top. Sophia, trembling with rage, tried to hold on to the last vestiges of control, but deep down, she knew this was no longer her empire. It was Daniel's. The shock on Sophia's face was immediate, like a veil lifting from her eyes. She had always assumed she was the one in control, the one steering the ship, the one everyone revered. But now, as Daniel calmly laid out the truth, her entire world began to unravel. Every carefully crafted narrative she'd spun for herself, every time she'd belittled Daniel, dismissed his contributions, or stolen his ideas, was falling apart. The truth was undeniable. He had been the one pulling the strings all along, not her. Sophia tried to mask her panic with a facade of defiance, but her voice trembled when she spoke. "You can't just take everything from me, Daniel. I built this company. I made it great. You're nothing but a shadow behind me." Her words dripped with venom, but beneath the anger there was fear. Daniel, however, wasn't the broken man he once was. He was no longer the silent observer in his own life. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "I didn't take anything, Sophia. I let you believe it was yours, but this company and everything in it belongs to me. It always has." As she continued to shout, trying to manipulate him with every harsh word, Daniel's demeanor remained unshaken. Then, with a cold smile, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a document, his prenuptial agreement. "I think you should take a look at this," he said, sliding it across the table toward her. Sophia's hands shook as she scanned the contract, her eyes widening with each line. The agreement was ironclad. In the event of a divorce, she was entitled to nothing. Not the company, not the wealth, nothing. Daniel had been clever, securing his future from the moment they had married. He had always known that one day she would try to take everything from him. Her face contorted with fury as she tried to push the document aside. "This isn't over, Daniel. I'll make sure you regret this." Daniel stood up, his expression as cold as ice. "You're done, Sophia. Your reign ends now." Within moments, security entered the room. There was no argument, no negotiation. They escorted her out of the office, her last shred of power slipping away. As she was led down the hall, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor, Daniel felt a sense of finality. He had taken back control. Not just of the company, but of his own life. The door closed behind her, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt free. With the toxic weight of Sophia and the corrupt executives removed, Daniel wasted no time in transforming Summit Innovations. He understood that this wasn't just about reclaiming his position. It was about healing the company and its people. The wounds left by years of exploitation and fear ran deep, but Daniel was determined to rebuild Summit into a place of integrity, trust, and respect. He started with the culture. No longer would Summit thrive on fear and manipulation. The new leadership team he assembled was built on shared values of transparency, fairness, and inclusivity. Employees were encouraged to voice their opinions, to challenge ideas, and to innovate without the fear of retribution. Open communication became the cornerstone of the company, and Daniel made it clear that every individual's well-being mattered. It didn't take long for the changes to be felt. Employee satisfaction soared as people who had once been silenced now felt empowered to contribute. The toxic atmosphere that had plagued the company for so long was replaced with one of collaboration and mutual respect. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, and rebuilding trust took time, but Daniel's vision began to take root. Former employees, those who had been wronged and driven out by the old regime, started to return. They came back with fresh ideas, with a sense of loyalty and gratitude. The talent that had been lost to Summit was now returning in full force. Their energy was contagious, bringing a new vigor to the company and allowing Daniel to push even harder toward his vision of what Summit Innovations could become. The changes didn't go unnoticed. Clients, once skeptical about Summit's integrity, began to notice the improvements. Word spread about the company's transformation, and new business opportunities began to pour in. Summit Innovations, once marred by corruption and scandal, was now a shining example of resilience and redemption. It became a symbol of what could be accomplished when a company was built on integrity and honesty, rather than manipulation and deceit. Daniel's confidence continued to grow as Summit thrived under his leadership. For the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not just because of the company's success, but because he had reclaimed his life and built something meaningful. The man who had once been known as the failed husband was now a respected leader, and his company was stronger than ever. And as he looked toward the future, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. Summit Innovations had been reborn, and with it, so had he. As Daniel stood at the window of his office, looking out over the sprawling city skyline, he couldn't help but reflect on his journey. It had been a long, hard road, one that had taken him from the shadows of his wife's success to the powerful position he now held at the helm of Summit Innovations. He had spent so many years quietly watching, being dismissed, and living in the wake of Sophia's brilliance. But now, he had reclaimed everything that had been taken from him. He had transformed from the failed husband into a confident, respected leader, someone who commanded respect not just because of his position, but because of the strength and resilience he had shown throughout his journey. The corporate culture at Summit had completely shifted, with transparency, trust, and integrity at the forefront. Daniel was no longer the invisible man behind the scenes. He was now the face of the company, leading it with a vision that was entirely his own. Sophia and her associates, on the other hand, had been consumed by their own greed and deceit. Their careers were in ruins. Melissa, Angela, Greg, and Scott had been exposed for their crimes and were now facing the consequences of their actions. Sophia, once so powerful and untouchable, was now a shadow of her former self, her name tarnished, her empire crumbling. Her downfall was inevitable, a direct result of the manipulative, toxic culture she had cultivated and the lies she had lived by. For Daniel, the sense of relief was profound. He had shed the weight of a life that wasn't his own and stepped into the role he had always been meant to play. Summit Innovations was thriving under his leadership, and with it, his personal freedom. There were no more apologies, no more second guessing. This was his company, his life, and he was finally in control. Daniel's journey was a testament to the importance of self-respect, patience, and the power of taking control of one's own life. For years, he had lived under the shadow of others, his wife's success, his colleagues' deceit, and a toxic corporate culture. But through quiet persistence and careful strategy, Daniel had reclaimed everything that was rightfully his company, his identity, and his peace of mind. Now, fully in charge, Daniel was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The company was thriving, and Summit Innovations had become a beacon of resilience and integrity. He had rebuilt not just a business, but his life, showing the world that true power could often be found in the most unexpected places. His story was one of redemption, of reclaiming what had been lost, and of finding the strength to rise again, even when the odds seemed impossible. And as Daniel looked forward, he knew the best was yet to come.